going to try. So we're going to try and put this here. If I hold it, I might actually end up just yelling into it. So I don't really think I need to introduce myself. You all know me pretty well. My area is, as you know, is international relations, and particularly, obviously, also considering my background, European politics. So I was actually very excited to prepare this lecture here, which I think is in many ways actually distinct from my last one a week ago. Remember, was structured aligned with the relational. So this one today is sort of a different angle, right, on a similar situation. And so we'll be focusing today on Europe a little more specifically. Obviously, the US is still kind of a little large in that sort of larger context. But particularly European security, future European security, with regard also to Ukraine. Because the outcome of the Ukraine war will in sort of substantial ways determine the future of European security and by extension the transatlantic relationship. So actually going through the program for this spring, there is a lot. So you've heard certain things, you've heard multiple times, right? Different people, different colleagues have spoken about not perfectly similar things, but about so many different aspects of the connected to relationship. So I just wanted to get a little bit of context here by re-emphasizing how pivotal this transatlantic relationship was, not just for the US and Europe, but for the global affairs more broadly speaking, right? So would have shown post-World War II international relations. It also was in many ways the backbone for it was the backbone for what one could describe as a Western sort of predominance within the international system. When you look at the history of this relationship, then obviously it was always a very complex relationship, right? It's just a mix of mutual support, right? Debates about how we're going to split the burden, right, of maintaining this transatlantic alliance. These debates really are not brand new. Any student of transatlantic relations will quickly find out that these debates go back to the 60s, 70s, right? Burden sharing within NATO, different groups, an old topic, right? Obviously, with renewed relevance, but it's in and of itself nothing new. And then, of course, also at times, contrary sort of geopolitical outlooks on the world, right? With Europe always sort of being in that squeeze, right? So you have the United States on the one side in its wonderful geographic isolation, right? You have this wonderful sort of these two large bodies of water to the left and the right on the map. And that obviously makes it a bit different, where Europe, at least on one side, the east, right, always had to deal with a lot of unknowns and potential security threats. So that obviously shaped the international relations. But despite all of this, it was a strong relationship. I would say over the last 10 years, a lot of parties involved in this transatlantic relationship have started questioning, right, the foundations of this, right? And there's a generally a lot of concern these days that it might actually be weakening. So in that context, obviously now the Ukrainian war plays a very particular role, very pivotal role. And I thought it might be actually worth to do a very brief historical overview, right? Because a lot of people talk about the Ukraine, but people are often a little less well informed about how this country actually came into. And that in and of itself is a very interesting story and actually highly relevant for understanding the contemporary. So in sort of comparative government, there's this whole subfield called transformation studies or transitional studies, where you basically look at how once communist countries sort of transitioned to something else. And in some cases, this was a quite successful transformation from obviously communist countries to what we now generally define as a liberal democracy that also has a functioning market economy. I mean, if you think about sort of most of the children of this transformation, it would have been Poland, right? For many years it was Hungary, but also the Czech Republic, right? These were all very successful transitions. And then there were cases that were a little more problematic and complex and incomplete. And the Ukraine is one of these. Right? So it wasn't a straightforward path for the Ukraine. And that started already in 1991 with what is generally called, described as an accidental independence. Right? So that wasn't a big revolution, right? It wasn't a public uprising, right? Like in Hungary or in Poland, Greece, and Germany. Right, there wasn't a long history of strong political opposition, right, that would demand system change, right? This was more sort of what we would describe as negotiated independence, right, between an existing liberal opposition that was not that strong, right, compared to other countries, and a subgroup of communists in power that were sort of nationalistic, right, and that were fine with their independence as long as they would remain in power. And so this was sort of a big deal. This was a negotiated deal in 1991, where these two groups would sort of form an alliance and push for independence. Right? This is followed by, I mean, we are obviously condensing, a couple of decades here of post-communist history, but we had a string of more or less reform-oriented governments that were, however, always pro-Russian. So, sort of, we're always keeping an eye out on what Moscow wanted or what Moscow was saying, right? And it was sort of many elections in those years were not completely free, right? There was always the charge of manipulation, right? So it wasn't like, these elections are, get us approval, from foreign observers who hadn't been digitally executed. In the late 90s, early 2000s, the constitution has changed, right, into a more presidential system, right? So basically, resulting in a power consolidation at the presidential level, and that obviously caused problems down the road, right? This era sort of comes to a temporary stop in 2004, where the elections were so manipulated that the people finally went to the streets. And that is the famous Orange Revolution, right? So that was basically the outrage by the people that the president at the time, like Leonid Kuchma, had sort of really interfered with the elections to an extent that finally was deemed unacceptable. So here you have a photo. Sorry, I don't have a complete picture. I thought this was. I forgot about that. I'm sorry. You haven't seen anything, so I don't know where the clicker is. Because now all you see is the title here, right? And I don't have to click right now. And the young colleague here has abandoned me. So anyway, just imagine a lot of people in a public square with a lot of orange flags and merch. Almost like it looks almost like an outing like Golden State University. Lots of orange. So anyway, I'm sorry about that. I'm totally proud of it. So this orange revolution was sort of the first, try at really now pushing the system towards a more liberal, more transparent, more democratic system. In the wake of the Orange Revolution, you get a number of governments that are more Western-oriented, that are more pro-Western, and that process again comes to a temporary halt in 2010 with the election of the new president, Viktor Yanukovych, who was pro-Russian. So you see there's a constant tension between sort of pro-Western and sort of Russian-leaning administrations, right? And in 2013, the Ukraine was on the verge of signing the so-called association agreement with the European Union. So an association agreement is sort of is a couple steps before you start seriously thinking about membership in the European Union, right? It's sort of the opening agreements where the European Union will commit money, right? For things like infrastructure, you will start, talking to the country that, it's like you get a fitness instructor, right? The fitness instructor sort of slowly gets you into shape, right, for an application, right? So think about it that way. So much, so here, I was just throwing in, just to have an idea where the Ukraine was, and that red line actually denotes what used to be the former Soviet Union. So there's actually another element, and I'm going to step back here for a second. Like other countries like Poland, right, or Hungary, but they were satellite countries, right? But they were technically their own countries. The Ukraine is one of many countries actually that used to be a Soviet republic, right? So it used to be part of the Soviet Union, right? So that in and of itself also made a difference, right, in how this whole transformation process played out. Right? Now I can actually, there we go. That's the sea of orange, right? And that's actually from the 2014, the so-called Euromaidan revolution. So again, the people go to the streets, particularly young people in 2014, because the Ukraine steps back from signing that agreement with the European Union, right? So they do not sign the agreement. And that's because of pressure from Russia. And so the people were really upset about this. And so this wasn't some sort of like takeover by Nazis or something like that, right? It was later spun by Moscow, right? It was really people going to the streets because they were upset about this Western turn, right? Of the Ukraine coming to the south. Moscow was so as this argument on revolution played out, and then the government has to deal with the fallout from this. You have simultaneously sort of a local conflict in the eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, which does have a Russian-speaking population. Maybe you could call it a minority, right? But already in 2013, like in the 2010s, you have sort of stirrings in the eastern Ukraine, right? Where Russian separatists that were obviously always backed by Russia started causing trouble. Well, they were fighting for independence, right? But and of course, that happened pretty soon. We saw evidence of Russians actually coming in from Russia, right? And backing the separatists. The Russians always said, "Oh, it's not bullshit. It's just volunteers." You know? Miraculous, there's well, and I didn't do anything about that. These people are free to obviously, follow their calling. So in that sort of situation of flux, Russia decided to annex the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, right? So it's quite a shock. Also under false pretenses, right? We got to protect the Russian minority there because the Poland is so suppressed, over the Ukrainian. And to me, in retrospect, it was 2014. 2014 was our unique with regard to the Ukraine, because the Europeans and also the US didn't do anything about it. So this was still the Obama administration. They had other concerns, right? I think they were just really distracted with other things. And that was one of these red lines that were crossed by Putin without any serious consequences. So I think after that it just became more important. It took obviously years, but that's when he knew he could get away with something like that. Because that was the first sort of violent change for the border in Europe after 1945. So the Europeans and the US try to sort of, hash it out with Russia after that, and this so-called Minsk agreement, where basically the Ukraine said, fine, we're gonna grant these Russian-speaking regions in the east of the Ukraine sort of regional autonomy, in exchange for territorial sovereignty. It means we maintain sort of the territorial integrity of the Ukraine. Well, as we all know, this would eventually be unsuccessful, right? But after 2014, long story short, there's a clear tendency for the Ukraine to increasingly move westward. So they eventually do sign the association agreement, right? And that means the Ukraine also became eligible to engage in free trade with the European Union. So an association agreement usually is what we call asymmetric liberalization. That means that the country, potential candidate countries can start exporting to the European Union, and we don't expect there to come, right? So the Ukrainians didn't have to open up their market to the same extent, because the European common market is so competitive that it basically almost crushed. This is kind of just so I like to think it is sort of development. Okay, so things are, slowly moving in that direction. And then we have the year 2016, where a lot of the things that were taken for granted are first coming to fruition, right? So I just chose this photo, which is actually not a NATO meeting. This photo is from a G7 summit, right? But you see Angela Merkel still, we all missed her quite dearly actually. But you can clearly see she is not happy. She's dealing with somebody who is maybe not even listening really, right? And then another person has followed from Grace in the meantime, right? John Bolton, former national security advisor. So that's when things start to become a little bumpy, right? However, as I was looking up things for the day, I realized that it wasn't 2016 where NATO started thinking about, we're going to protect the European NATO. Didn't start thinking about, we're going to increase our military spending in 2016. That was actually already done in the wake of the annexation of Crimea in 2014. It was a NATO summit in Wales, where they, for the first time, made it to increase their military spending. And that's when we defined the 2% GDP target to be reached by 2024. So it's not the Trump administration cost this, right? It was the Russian administration. So by 2025, all neighbors have met the target. So 31 out of 32 members have made the target. Iceland can't meet the target because Iceland doesn't have technology. but everybody else is at 3% overall. In some countries, significantly so. Now, it's kind of interesting to follow this development within NATO from Trump to Biden. Trump obviously, Trump administration, the first Trump administration, put more pressure on the Europeans, and I would argue rightly so. I was never against it, but with a saying in Austria, I mean, I'm from Vienna, but the tone makes the music, right? It's how you deliver the message, right? Now, for a long time, the Americans delivered the message very nicely. The Europeans were like, yeah, I hear you, but I really don't think so. And then Trump, the first Trump administration, put a lot of emphasis, but there were still people in the administration that were constructive, right, and understood the states. So the Europeans started listening at that point. Biden, during the Biden administration, Biden was in many ways what I would describe as an old school transatlanticist, right? And then suddenly there were 4 years of like, oh, we're going back to the good old times, you know. And then with the second Trump administration coming in with the last year, things are very good. So there was no more nice tone, and there was what we put in modern United Nations situation on their room. It's a very hard message delivered in very hard terms. So just to show you some here, if this would work. Okay. So this is basically from data. This is the most current data directly from data. Here you see the defense expenditure as a share of GDP, and that's 2 components. That's military equipment, right? So that's your planes, your cannon, your ammunition, whatever, and infrastructure. Because the Europeans did realize years ago that they actually have a problem with regard to infrastructure, right? So that's your rail lines, that's your highways, anything that enables you to move troops eastward. And that's a legacy of the Iron Curtain. Right? So there's really, it's easy in Europe to travel north-south, right? And it's easy to travel east-west until you hit what used to be the full Iron Curtain. And then it gets a little less easy. So, and then despite, you know, investments in the past, now they really have to make it, right? And modernize infrastructure into the east. So that's part of that too. And here you see that the countries, many countries have significantly increased their spending. For obvious reasons, it's not a big surprise to see that Poland, which is a frontline state, obviously has spent a lot more than the 2% for quite a while now. And it's also no surprise that the Baltic states are spending much more than the 2%, right? So things are definitely changing, but you can't flip the switch from one day to another, right? It takes time, right? And that's part of the problem these days. That there's so much pressure and there's fear, right? That the US might in one way or another pull out before the Europeans are able to fully take care of their own security. Okay. Now. Come on.
Excuse me.
Yes, please.
So I'm looking at the United States, and in 2014, we spent more our percentage of GDP was higher than in 2025. Is that correct?
Yeah, but that's because you have the dramatic GDP growth, right? Because this is in 2021, right? So yeah, I mean, it looks like the US is spending less, and you're probably spending less as a percentage of the GDP, although in absolute hundreds of billions of dollars, you don't spend less, right? But that's sort of It has to do with the methodology, how we characterize what those are used. But it's still not there. We'll switch to the next one. There we go. Sorry. I thought it within the road margin option top because so that maybe represent the ending right now. So I don't know if you follow world news daily, but we recently had the Davos meeting, and last week the security conference, the Munich Security Conference, which in the last 2 decades probably has really turned itself into sort of well, the Wall Street Journal recently is that maybe Munich is the new Davos, right? Davos is just for the AI bros and the hippies, and Munich is sort of where the tough talk happens. But I think at these 2 meetings, if you take them together, you could clearly see how sort of leaders on both sides of the Atlantic are grappling with unraveling of this alliance in some ways. I brought this up at the end of the last lecture a couple of weeks ago, right? There's a feeling of shock. Not that it came as a complete surprise, but I think the ferocity of sort of the current administration and sort of and the contempt, also the disrespect for the European allies, just became so visible, and it's that element, right? That motivated me to bring it over. So. If you listen to the Canadian Prime Minister Carney, and that was at Davos, but also if you listen last week to what the German Chancellor had to say about transatlantic relations, there is now they all come to the realization that things have probably moved past the point where you can go back to the business as usual. So there's definitely sort of the shock moment, and now sort of trying to figure out how to move forward. So in other words, the Europeans are trying to figure out, okay, how can we become more independent? There's a lot of talk about independence and sovereignty, not just in the military sphere, but also in the technological sphere, right? A lot of talk about digital sovereignty. That will also take time. This is the spirit that will take time to achieve that sort of independence. So, in sheer strategic terms, the Europeans are debating and trying to figure out what needs to happen for them to become independent in terms of military capabilities, while at the same time, for them, at least for now, try to maintain a working relationship with the United States. I don't think that NATO will unravel, but I think that maybe the US component of NATO will, shrink over time, right? And that obviously means that Europeans will have to shoulder a large part of that. So now, in that context, now let's look at the Ukraine. Right? It's been going on for a long time, 4 years now. The Ukraine has punched way above its weight line. Right? What Mr. Putin thought was going to be a 2-week special military operation, right, has turned into a 4-year war of attrition. The Ukraine has really fought valiantly, obviously with material support of primarily the US for a long time, and then to a small extent the Europeans. Since for the last 1 year, basically, the European portion had to increase significantly because the US has sort of reduced its support quite drastically. And so, the effect of this has been overall an incremental weakening of the Ukraine's ability to keep fighting. right? So they're slowly draining the resources. And that's long game. Anyway. He always said that he can go on forever. It doesn't matter to him. So that's the Ukraine's problem, right? The Trump administration, it appears to me, just wants to get rid of this whole problem. Right? They just try to get out of it somehow with the ability to sell this sort of state. Right? Unfortunately, most of the recent moves and initiatives have happened without consulting the Europeans. So they wake up and they find out that the president made a statement about a new initiative, and they're like, wait a moment, nobody talked to us, what's happening. So there's not I would say, a very good coordination happening, right? And it needs that coordination also to actually create a sort of cohesive thought, right? In our dealings with that. So that's a real challenge. That's the current front. So everything in red is controlled by Russia at this point. Everything that's blue was taken in the initial blitz, right, by Russia, but since then has sort of been retaken by the Ukraine. So that's where we currently are. That's like a couple of days ago. But obviously, slowly, the Russians are advancing again, right? It was a stalemate for a very long time, but now simply the Russian troops are thinned out. It was a very long front line, and they have recruitment problems, they have supply problems, right? So it's honestly, I don't think the Ukraine has the ability to win this. The Russians simply have a stronger position in the long run. As incompetent as the Russian army is, right? So if you've learned one thing that you don't really have, I mean, you don't have to worry about the Russian conventional forces, but they have depleted their arsenal to such an extent that I'm not sure if without support from Iran, right? That's with support provided drones. North Korea, China in the background, right? I don't think Russia will be able to maintain this. Right? So we have basically a couple scenarios how this can end. Scenario number one, ultimately Russia prevails, and is able to somehow win this war. Or come out of negotiations on the winning side, right? So that would probably entail a loss of the eastern parts of Ukraine beyond what they control now. The current talks between the Trump administration and Putin, the Russians are always asking basically for all of them, in those areas that they haven't set foot in. So if the Russians win that, right, they might ask for a complete demilitarization of the Ukraine, or at least a significant demilitarization. They might be able to finagle what I would call a Russian-backed puppet government. So again, basically go back to pre-2014, we had a government that is very sort of pro-Russian, right? And really always takes into consideration national interests. Basically what they have done in Georgia, right, after 2008, where they also, people remember that, but the Russians actually attacked Georgia in 2008. Also, as this country was applying for a NATO membership. And then under some murky sort of justification, they went in there and spent some time in Georgia to make sure that this country would not turn westward. And that's, of course, the ideal scenario for Mr. Putin, right? That he would maintain indirect control of what the Russians have always called the near Rod. Right? Sort of a chain of fixed Soviet republics that it would ideally not control directly, but have at least pro-Russian governments in charge. If the Russians win, then the Ukraine becomes a satellite de facto, a satellite state, just like Belarus these days. And it would also, of course, result in Russia being much more emboldened to try that again in other parts of the former Soviet Union. Excuse me. Scenario number 2, that Ukraine sort of survives it, somehow prevails with territorial loss, but with continued independence, complete independence, security guarantees from the West, but no NATO membership. And then, of course, the big question is, well, what kind of security guarantees are we talking about? Right? How strong are they? How binding would they be? Who would send those guarantees? Right? And can the Ukrainians trust those guarantees? And the Russian state those guarantees serious. Did they come from the European Union or the US, both of them? So this is sort of one of the scenarios. Scenario 3, which I call here Ukraine Prevail 2.0, is that they actually come out rather victorious, right? Which means the Russians sort of at some point cave. That's like, that's like the dream sometimes have, that something miraculous happens in Moscow, Mr. Putin, I don't know, false death in Moscow, or there's an elite battle inside the elite, whatever it is, right? Or we somehow given a way out of this, David's faith. And the Ukraine can basically choose its destiny, right? With the Ukraine would it always wanted at first, this would probably apply for a NATO membership. And then the question becomes, so NATO membership comes with Article 5 protection, right? As you remember, I called it the 4 musketeer rule, right? One for all, one for one. That obviously would extend to the Ukraine, but what would probably not happen, because we don't oppose the war again, right, would be foreign NATO troops on Ukrainian territory, and also no foreign-run military bases in Ukraine, right? And that has been called sort of the Norway model, right? I mean, when Norway joined NATO, they basically, in order to calm the Russians down, right, said we will not have any foreign NATO troops stationed on our territory, and we won't have any foreign military bases on our territory. So it is still NATO membership with Article 5 backing, but not with sort of foreign presence on the territory. The last scenario is that we get a neutral Ukraine with some sort of international security guarantees. Right? So that basically could be described as the Finlandization of the Ukraine, or the Austrianification. Right? Because Austria, maybe Austria is even a better model, because for Austria to become independent after World War II, our way out basically was a neutrality. A neutrality that was sort of guaranteed by the 4 occupying powers, right? So the Soviet Union, France, Great Britain, and the US. So that's legally backed in international law too. Is that an ideal situation on neutrality? I mean, and again, what would those security guarantees come from the West? They would probably have to come from the West mostly, right? But how strong would they be? And would this deter the Russians from meddling with their Ukrainian future? So,
what's the odds? What is your prediction?
You know, I don't like prediction. I don't think the neutral Ukraine is in anybody's interest except Russia's, right? I'm seriously hoping for scenario number 2. That's my hope, right? I don't think the total victory, Ukrainian victory is possible.
Number 2.
Number 2.
Supplying them.
Yes.
That's not going to happen.
Not anymore. Well, not troops right now. It's mostly about can we replace the United States, like the delivery of UAS weapons to the Ukraine. The Europeans are basically buying. So, instead of delivering them directly to the Ukraine, right, now the Europeans buy the stuff from the United States and then deliver it to the Ukraine. I don't know, maybe it looks better on paper.
Feeling that Ukraine has been running out of people. I mean, it's like you're trying to say no troops, but where are the troops going to come from? From what I understand, there's a lot of defections that people are
Yes.
not happy, and Ukraine has been devastated. And it seems to me, well, I follow Raymond he was a CIA analyst under 3 presidents during the Cold War, and he got the position because he had a master's in Russian history and whatever, who speaks Russian at the he found it. And he said from the get-go, Russia is 5 times bigger than Ukraine. There's no way. And he also says the problem started in 1990 with the unification of Germany, because the West orally acknowledged that, I mean, it's like the Soviet Union agreed to the unification of Germany, and the understanding was that NATO would not go east. And we wouldn't put up with somebody that said they were against us, I mean, China or Russia, in Canada or Mexico. You know, I was taught to look at how the other guy looks at that.
Sure.
And my understanding is that the Ukrainian, once Ukraine got independence, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, their constitution guaranteed the Russian-speaking people in Eastern Ukraine would pretty much have autonomy.
Yeah.
And the other countries that, I mean, the other areas that Russia has taken forcibly since 1990 was because they didn't honor this, I mean, and the war, I understand, started in 2014 in Eastern Ukraine. Well, and we put in the government we wanted after essentially a coup. The elected people were thrown out. We wouldn't put up with a foreign country. Russia came actually and they negotiated with the people that overturned our election. We wouldn't put up with it. I was taught to look at how it looks from the other side.
Sure. But just, you know, maybe the regional autonomy wasn't, perfect, but it's one thing to sort of quarrel or argue over, how much autonomy they really get versus, just kind of walk in there now and take over. And look, this is, I mean, that's a whole other level. But now you're talking about the violation of sovereignty, which you need to learn from the top. It's a big moment.
The United States government telling people in the Southwest they can't speak Spanish. My understanding was that the Russian-speaking people in Eastern Ukraine were allowed to, and then the government that we helped put in 2014.
Well,
You still have to have Spanish or I mean, have speak Russian, or, I mean, they were trying to get rid of their culture
Or,
with that, or at least most Americans would, I think.
yeah. It's complicated, right? But, sorry, there's another.
I read two papers lately. One said that Putin wants Americans and the rest of the world to be convinced that he's winning the war, when actually he's not really winning, but that's what he wants people to be. It's also struggling finding soldiers to send to Ukraine. They are recruiting in Africa, promising them jobs, and they get there and they make them soldiers. Now, of course, those people from Africa, they want a paycheck, so some of them go to war. But I can't imagine that those mercenaries are very effective. They don't have a job in this fight, except they want a paycheck. And they're recruiting around the world. You've heard about the North Koreans going there. Same situation, they're drafted, they don't have a choice. So Putin is also struggling. He doesn't want us to see that, but he's not winning.
Well, you know, he never changed his rhetoric, right? It's still just a special military, special operation, right? And he's definitely trying to avoid a general threat. So they're recruiting anywhere but, you know, from the general population. I mean, you always find volunteers in the population, but from everything I've read and seen, it's a lot of minorities, right, within Russia, like prisons, right, brutal recruiting grounds for ex-prisoners, yeah. So, and he wants to avoid a general draft because, I mean, I guess everybody has to know in Russia that this is obviously a war and not just a tiny operation. But, and the economic consequences, I mean, it is not a word count. But, yeah, he has just a longer, like, you know, he just has more time at the beginning. It is my personal theory, just to finish that the main reason NATO, we can debate endlessly if this was correct or not in the 90s to expand NATO eastward. I would argue that the East Europeans were realists in the 90s. They didn't trust Russia. It is also my personal opinion that every country has the independent rights to decide how they want to organize their security. And that's actually also true for the Ukraine. Now, I do understand that you could argue that the Russians were threatened by NATO, but obviously I look at this from the Western side and say, no, NATO was never an offensive alliance, right? There's always a defensive alliance. The Russians might have gotten that impression because NATO simply started managing conflicts, right, in its periphery. But I mean, obviously, I'm looking at this as a Westerner, right? I mean, like, there's no way NATO is gonna attack, you know, the Russian Federation. I really think that the reason why he ultimately went in was because the Ukraine was making serious progress in its domestic reforms, political and economic reforms. And well, you know, transparency and corruption, you know, strengthening the political system, you know, reorganizing the economy, right? Basically doing all the things that in the long run are expected from EU candidates. The rule of law, and so on, right? Everything that makes you ready to join the European Union. Now that would have been such an embarrassment, right? Because the Russians would have looked at the Ukraine and say, well, they're getting all of this good stuff, you know, what about us, right? We are, despite all our oil and gas revenues, you know, we're still sort of struggling every day, right? So for me, this is a mass of, I don't think he was sort of true visionary, like that was always a concern, right? That was just a weak spot. And now it's regularly undersea communication cables, right? That somehow miraculously gets chopped into pieces by incompetent ship captains, right? So there's a lot of stuff actually going on, and hybrid warfare, right? Propaganda, and all of this. And it's the Europeans are aware of this, and it's another part of what they're trying to, improve, or just their cyber warfare capabilities, right? To determine this, to detect the activities actually. So yes, they can hold it up, and they have, right? At the recent summit, they said we don't want to. We're skeptical sending that money to the Ukraine, but they can't block it. That's not possible. They can delay, but there's an alternative decision-making method in the European Council, right? Where you move from unanimity to, well, basically the countries that are willing to move on with them, move along with that proposal, and you just leave the countries out that basically resist that. And it's not Hungary, it's also, so the new, it's my fifth column, it's sort of like the subversive powers in Europe these days. Hungary, Slovakia, and since the presidential elections a couple of weeks ago, the Czech Republic. They elected a billionaire who has warm feelings towards Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin simultaneously. So that might indicate a shift of the Czech Republic to at least temporarily. So those are the three that are, I don't want to say they do most of bidding, but they are sort of, they hold things up, right, and this whole things down. And the Hungarians argue with, they want basically they accuse the Ukrainians of stopping the delivery of gas, right, from Russia. Because the Russian gas has to come through the Ukraine. That has always been an issue since the Ukrainian independence, right? Those gas transits. So that was part of the reason why they even started building the Nord Stream gas pipeline in the first place. So when the Germans kind of, I want to almost say backsteps the Ukrainians there, by taking leverage away from the Ukrainians, vis-a-vis the Russians, creating this alternative route. The Ukrainians basically say, well, listen, this is a war, right? Gas pipelines get hit, and so there's this back and forth. I still have one slide though, actually. Sorry, we sort of got not that I don't like the discussion, okay, but I'm just gonna finish my thought here. This technology lets me actually. Now let me just wrap up my part, right, and then we can quickly come back to Q&A. So big questions ahead, right? Besides how the question of how the Ukraine war will sort of conclude. What's the future of that kind of relationship, right? Can we maintain sort of a working relationship, right? I don't think that NATO will sort of dissolve, right? There's just also in Congress, I think there are still constructive voices on the Republican side who see the benefits of NATO. Right? So you might see a sort of a shift within NATO, right? Of the Europeans taking more care of themselves, right? But still having sort of security backing by the US, however that may look like, right? How quickly can, so that's question one, how quickly can the European sort of scale up their own defense? How quickly can they do it? And will they be able to do that before the US sort of significantly reduces its commitment, right, to Europe? That's so it's a question of timing, right? Can Europe master the political will and the resources to help Ukraine, let's say, in a post-conflict reconstruction? I think we'll pay most of that, we'll have to, right? I don't really see the US committing a lot of resources to maybe reconstructing what is the Ukraine. And then obviously the elephant in the room, what are we going to do with Russia? For this mostly this conflict is coming. How are we going to engage with Russia in the future? Possibly under continued Putin presidency, right? But I don't know how you sort of get back to some sort of constructive relationship with this. That's I really don't know. I don't even want to speak on it. This is so far out in my mind. Yeah. Sorry, so these were just my big sort of questions again for the future. Yes, ma'am.
Ukraine was called the breadbasket. I mean, they are feeding a lot of people. Are they still producing food, or is much of the rest of the world suffering?
Partly it is suffering because the Ukraine is one of, I think it's wheat, right? One of the largest wheat producers. So that obviously has dropped dramatically, but they still do export wheat, just not in the same amount.
There's some stuff like Brazil picked up and soybeans and hogs to
Well, certainly the story is
put in.
well, the wheat, wheat and soybeans are two different things, right? I mean,
Right.
the wheat is really like for bread and stuff like that around the world, right? I mean, that's part of the increase in food prices around the world, right? I mean, part of that has to do with things like that, right? But there's just a shortage of wheat. And it's not something you can't just, Ukraine is a great basket for a reason, right? Because it has the right climate, right? And the right weather patterns for that, right? The right soil. That's not just something you can quickly sort of pull up and scale up somewhere else. Yes, please.
How does Zelensky fit into the picture? He has been such a courageous man and has been the face of Ukraine. After 4 years of what they've gone through, do the people still support him? And what would happen if something happened to Zelensky and he was out of the picture? Is there anybody else that has that kind of charisma and courage? People.
Again, to me personally, he is always a hero, right? To me, for me, I mean, stand-up comedian, right? With Jewish background, but allegedly the leader of a Nazi-fied country, according to most, I mean, this was always sort of, Looney Tunes, right? So from what I read, the support is still high. Right? And partly has to do with the fact that he there was news about the corruption scandal, right? I mean, the corruption has always been a problem in Ukraine, so baked into the system. But and people say, oh, I should support, look how corrupt they are. And I'm like, no, wait, but the anti-corruption just seem to work, right? Because there's people get caught, right? And they actually replace them, right? So, and that was a very close ally of his, right? It was actually the Minister of Defense, I think, if I remember correctly.
Expired, and they just haven't had elections.
That's a good question. I don't know.
Because of the war, they haven't elected.
Yeah.
Would negotiate with Zelensky because he said he would.
Well, it's a little hard to have elections, with the population living abroad, refugees, you're actively fighting war. Of course, I understand the argument about legitimacy, right? But under these circumstances, I think any election would just logistically be possible, more or less be impossible.
That can be a reason to keep the war going too.
Well, again, Putin has many reasons to keep that war going, right? Because what happens if somehow the US, somehow Russia, like, I don't want to say loses, right? But just get to the point where they have to agree to some sort of peace agreement. Like, I mean, how do you, that's one of the biggest challenges. How do you allow Putin to get out of this and still go home and claim some sort of trophy, right? That would enable him to stay faith, right? That's I think one of the biggest challenges.
Sounds to me like Putin wanted to negotiate with Obama, and Biden wouldn't. And there was a negotiation in Turkey or something, a couple, 3 months after the war started. And the West told Zelensky to go home and fight. I thought that's the way I understand it.
Yeah. But what did the Russians have asked for in those negotiations? What would they have asked for?
They're people. No, but then we fought the Civil War too, and they were all people. I mean, it's like no matter what side on you're fighting, you're all.
You know, for me, this is, again, my personal opinion, I think even at the base of times, the way things work for the Ukraine in military terms was lukewarm. Like if you deal with a schoolyard bully, what do? How do you take care of a bully? Either you punch him in the face like really hard, so he doesn't do it again, or you have to build alliances with others, and gang up on him.
Alliances like NATO undermine the charter of the UN.
No, the UN Charter explicitly allows collective defense agreement. It's Article 51 of the UN Charter. So NATO.
Offensive action
Sure.
is
That's not allowed.
Don't gang up and correct the person they're aligned with or the country they're aligned with.
Sorry,
It's frustrating. No, but I mean the people in the alliance.
Yeah. So Article 5, that's all based on a NATO member being attacked, right? So Article 5, that guarantee kicks in case that one of the NATO members gets attacked, right?
So it doesn't account for one of the member NATOs attacking somebody not in the alliance.
No, but let's still that, wouldn't do that, right? Well, yes, the US is in a particular position, but so that's backed by, so that's Article 5, and Article 5 again is backed by the UN Charter, Article 51, right, which allows these collective defense alliances. Right? Now, has NATO always paid strict adherence to the UN Charter? No. Right? The first intervention in Bosnia in 1995 was backed by the Security Council and therefore legal in the international law. 4 years later, the air campaign against in Kosovo and against Serbia was not backed by the UN, and so technically speaking, illegal, right? And that, of course, put the Russians, like, they were really upset about it, right? And I don't know if people remember that, but when NATO then came into Kosovo, basically, right? And we had sort of like left the Russians to the side a little bit. But there was a peacekeeping contingent of Russians in Bosnia. Yeltsin basically landed this overnight coup where he basically told the Russians, you go from wherever they were in Bosnia and drive straight all the way down during the night to show up in Kosovo. And then they basically took control of the airport in Pristina. Right, and as NATO was sort of preparing to come in, suddenly the Russians took charge of the airport in Pristina, and that was just to signal sort of how frustrated the Russians were with not being adequately consulted. Right, so I'm not saying NATO is perfect in those moments. Right, they did it for the right reasons, but they didn't have. There was no way they were going to get a second sort of Security Council resolution, right, like it was there. So. they caused a huge stir with huge conflicts within NATO, because, I mean, can you imagine at that point you had a coalition government in Germany made up of Social Democrats and Greens, the most pacifist like party in German history. And it was the German foreign minister, Joschka Fischer, who basically said, guys, we gotta do this, you know? If we don't want NATO to be a paper tiger, right, and become irrelevant, then we have to go in and do this, right? With or without UN backing. And so they went in. This was a political decision. So in this case, it's really UN.